Bem, boa tarde a todas e a todos. Vou passar ao inglês, porque é a língua oficial desta sessão. So welcome everybody and thank you for your presence. It's very important. I will present briefly Uriel, Orlow, if the battery allows me. Hello? Yes, it's working. Uriel Orlow, it's a Swiss-born artist with a diasporic background who lives and works between Lisbon, London and Zurich. His work has been presented as major international survey exhibitions, including the Venice Biennale, Manifesta, and the Manifesta 9 and 12 in Genk and Palermo, as well as the biennales in Berlin, Dakar, Taipei, Sharjah, Moscow, Kathmandu, Guatemala, Dunkirk, and many, many others. In 2023, he received the Swiss Grand Prix for Art, Prix Merit Oppenheim. In 2020, Orlow received the C.F. Meyer Prize, and in 2017, he received the Sharjah Biennale Prize. Orlow's practice is research-based, process-oriented, and often in dialogue with other disciplines and people. Projects engaged with residues of colonialism, spatial manifestations of memory, social and ecological justice, and plants as political actors. His multimedia installations focus on specific locations, micro-histories, and forms of haunting. Working across installation, photography, film, drawing, and sound, these works bring different image regimes and narrative modes into correspondence. So now the word is to Uriel Orlow. In the end, we have 20 minutes Q&A, dialogue with the audience, so feel free to ask questions to our artist. And finally, and most important, thank you, Uriel Orlow, for accepting our invitation and to be with us today. Thank you.
To be 1, 2, 3. Okay, better? Great. Thank you everyone for being here. That was quite a full-on introduction, I guess, so hopefully my talk will explain or expand on some of these words like microhistories and spatial memory and forms of haunting. It's called Collateral Memory, which is also the title of an exhibition that I have currently in Lisbon at the Galleria Avenida da India. And for this exhibition, even though it's a kind of one-room exhibition, I don't know if you've been to the gallery, it's just one space, but I decided to use it to reflect on relationships between works from the last 25 years. Through this question of collateral memory, and hopefully we'll get a sense of what I mean by that. I'm going to start with a short video clip of work that is also in the exhibition. Yeah.
Choetim vam roivim, hansim menukun chano, akafe hashilo, v'ma'aloes, hekedoishim utehoirim, que zajaro rokia umasirim esnishmas kilekedoshim shehola ve'olomim hebahur shenodbu sedoko evat hasikorahas henishmu soen edganida vehem meluchosoen loken balhorachamim ויסתדקו בסיסר כנוחו לאלוהים וישראל הם ישרוקו את החיים אס נשמו ישראל עדיין אנחנו ישראל וילוכו על משקובוהם אל בשולם ונועמה
So what do we have here? We start with the modernist grid, and we begin to discover a swimming pool. And as the camera pans upwards and we hear the sound, we realize that this is the architecture of a place of worship. It was a synagogue in Poznan in Poland, which was converted in 1942 by the Nazis into a swimming pool. And I guess I wanted to start with this work. It's one of my earliest works in order to position myself. As an artist, I felt very early on that I was marked by places that I have never lived in. I was marked by ghosts of an unspoken trauma. And so when I was a young artist, I wanted to travel to the countries of my grandparents, where my grandparents came from, and ended up in Switzerland. And one of my grandmothers was from Poland, and my other grandmother was from Hungary, and that's where I recorded the sound, the voiceover, which is a Jewish morning prayer that was sung in Szeged in southern Hungary. In the small town where my family was from, by the cantor who was one of a handful of survivors from that place. And yeah, I suppose I was interested as a sort of second, third generation survivor at a moment where witnesses were already old and were dying, what we do with this memory and with this history. And for me, it felt important to confront it in the present. And what I found here in this place was that it was in fact inscribed in the architecture of the building. So this is the first work where I started to think about this idea of spatial memory or spatial history. So what does that mean? It's not thinking about memory or history in terms of time and in terms of linearity, which would be a kind of timeline of past, present, future, but rather thinking of history in terms of place means it's simultaneous with us. It's still here. We can go back to it. We can't go back in time, but we can go back in place. We can go back and visit a place, and through that we are confronted with a form of responsibility. How do we respond to a place like that? What is a place like that saying to us? So I very consciously was not using any archival documents in order to tell this history or to try to think about this history or to make us think about it. So I want to continue positioning myself a little bit more with another work. I grew up in Zurich. This is the Café Odeon in Zurich, which is a beautiful Art Nouveau cafe, where during the First World War and during the Second World War, a lot of refugee intellectuals and artists were hanging out in order to exchange with each other, of course, and also to find out about what's going on in the war. So in this work, I created a sort of strange class reunion of the people from the First World War and the Second World War, who obviously were not all meeting each other and were not there at the same time. And the drawings are combined with newspapers, which the institution where the work is shown will add to every day with new newspapers from the day, which are then opened in order to show pages that talk about current wars. And unfortunately, I've never shown this work, and without there being any wars reported in the newspaper. So for me, it was kind of, again, interesting to think about the history of that cafe, the history of Zurich as this place of migration, of refugees, and what remains of that history. It's already a sort of a form of an embedded archive. I sometimes talk about latent archives, and with that I mean archives which are embedded in a place and not necessarily written in a document or not consisting of a selection of documents. And we will probably return speaking about latency, but maybe just this much here. What I'm interested in with latency and why I'm calling them latent archives is that there is a sort of inscription with latency which needs to be activated. And perhaps the easiest way to think about this is if we think about analog photography, where we have a film roll and an image is taken and is inscribed in the film but is not visible. It's latent on the film, and it needs to be processed in order to become visible. And so for me, what is interesting is places or things in the world that have this latency, that harbor histories and archives without necessarily sort of counting as official archives. However, I did start also working in archives, I suppose in this sort of trying to think about witnessing the Holocaust and what happens with this witnessing. And so I did a project in the first Holocaust archive in the world, which is called the Wiener Library, which started in Berlin as a kind of information center in the early 1930s, and then ended up in London later on in the 30s, and still exists there today. And it has a lot of books, but it also has original documents. And for this project, I decided to film the entire archive. So it's a 9-hour film, which shows every single shelf, a tracking shot of every single shelf. We don't see anything as such. We don't see any documents. We see the backs of books, like here. We can read the titles, or we see boxes, and it just says Warsaw Ghetto, or it. But we don't actually see a document. So I was trying to think about the archive as a material witness, also beyond the information which is contained in the document, the sheer materiality. And of course, the archive itself, and such an archive, is also a mirror of the impossibility of representation of something like the Holocaust. And it can't be contained, it can't all be seen. So the fact that the film is 9 hours long means that nobody can ever watch it because it exceeds the opening hours of the gallery where it's shown, and it just keeps running. And we have to make a decision as viewers how long we stay. So these early works already were sort of thinking about sort of engaging and recuperating certain forms of memory materially. Sort of over time, I started also to become a bit wary, and I was clearly thinking about also my relationship and my position in relation to these works. And I started to feel wary about, sort of, it sounds a bit counterintuitive, but a privileged position in relation to the work or the subject I was working on. And I was thinking about who should speak about what. And it's taken for granted that I, as a Jewish artist with a history which is rooted in this, would perhaps speak about this. But isn't this a history that should be thought about more generally? So when I was invited to make work for an exhibition about restitution, there was, I guess, a tacit expectation that I would make work about looted Holocaust art. But I was living in London at the time, and I decided not to do that, but to think about one of the biggest loots of modern times, which is the Benin bronzes, which are exhibited in the British Museum quite prominently, but alongside museums all over the Western world. The Benin bronzes, or the so-called Benin bronzes, are artifacts that were looted in 1897 by the British in a sort of retaliation against the Benin Kingdom, who refused to share their palm oil. So it was already then about oil. The British took the then king into exile and looted the entire cache of cultural artifacts. Actually, is it possible to turn the light on a little bit? It seems really dark. It's a little bit disconcerting. Yes, much better. It's a bit disconcerting. So for me, it was sort of important to think about this, and also to think about that question of responsibility. So I was not a descendant of anyone from the British Army who had committed this, and obviously I was not from the Benin Kingdom or from Nigeria, but at the same time I felt concerned. I felt involved somehow, because the objects are in the museum and are available for all to see, and the British Museum calls itself a universal museum. Of course, you need to have the means to travel to London and to stay there in order to see the works. So one of the first things that I did was collect the labels, the wall labels from the works that were exhibited from the moment the works arrived in Europe. I was quite concerned about sort of exhibiting the works again, or showing the works, because of the kind of automatic exoticization that would go with that. And I was more interested in thinking about how these works were seen. So what emerged was a kind of archive of the gaze, of looking. So these are the wall labels from exhibitions or catalogs from 110 years, across 110 years, which are mostly very ignorant, sometimes very racist. And it's only in the last sort of maybe, I think the last years where the people from Benin were actually asked to contribute information and texts for these kinds of labels. All the other labels were written by European anthropologists who thought they might know what these objects are about and what they speak about, but were actually very ignorant. The texts are in different languages, and it's 28 prints. And I wanted to print them all the same size, so they're kind of texts instead of images. And they're printed with a plaque that has a negative, which is exactly how the objects are made. So after that, I traveled to Benin City, and I sort of had to have an audience with the king to ask for permission to work there and to film there. And that audience was filmed. It was not something that I planned, but I guess it was a sort of gift, an inadvertent gift, that I then had to think about what it means and what this footage means. And I made a work out of that, which is called The Visitor, which is obviously me, which talks about this audience and sort of the conversation around restitution that we had. So I'm just going to maybe play a few minutes of that.
The assistant arrived early with a driver and a cameraman. They headed straight for the palace, which was in the center of the city. They drove through the big gate of the palace and parked the car at the edge of the royal compound. Finally, it was the visitors' turn. The king's secretary came out of the palace and told them the Oba was now ready to receive them. Inside, he presented the gift of red silk he brought from London. The Oba addressed him. "So, what are you researching?" "I know some of the Benin artifacts that were taken during the punitive expedition and are now exhibited at the British Museum in London. I wanted to come here to see for myself where they are actually from. My project is about questions of memory." The Oba replied, "I have no memories, so I'm not going to be much help. But the chiefs are here to answer questions you want to ask. We want to thank God, and we appreciate that someone has stumbled into our palace and is interested in the artifacts that have been stolen by the British. We are seriously agitated about it and want those things to come back." Are you aware of that, of what he just said? That you want the artifacts to come back? Yes, of course. How have you coped with the loss of the artifacts since then? We are pretty in isolation without those precious artifacts. And if those things were here now, we could tell you the fundamentals. We could tell you the genesis of this or that very artifact, which we cannot do now. So you see, we feel badly and we have not been very happy. I understand. Where are you from in England? Which part? I'm actually from Switzerland, but I live in London. The visitor didn't want to make things even more complicated by telling him that he is not really Swiss either, but that his family came to Switzerland from Eastern Europe.
Okay, we're going to leave it here. So obviously humor is actually plays an important role in this. The fact also that we might speak different languages, although we both speak English, but we sort of slightly speak cross purposes. And the joke is mostly on me. Of course, there's also a kind of cliche of the white European visitor at an African court, and the performance that goes with that. So I wanted to make that visible. And it's perhaps important to say, because this work was made in 2007, when there was no conversation around restitution, where museums were not engaged in returning things or even discussing restitution. It was just a completely sort of closed subject. These things are here now, and we're not talking about it. And I think we've come quite a long way in the meantime, and museums have started to return things with sometimes quite complicated narratives around that. But I suppose for me, the project was not just about physical restitution. It was also, like earlier works and later works, around various forms of restitution and different forms of justice which are needed, including acknowledging the past. What was also important, I suppose, is that the work is not a single work. So as you can see, there's the prints, and then there's this film. And then what I actually plan to do is, what we see here, is to have a look at what's going on at the moment in the present in terms of contemporary brass casting. Of course, the history of making artifacts did not stop when the British came and removed everything. The practice itself continued. And for me, it was interesting to engage with this practice of making the casts, because it raises a lot of important questions, including about the value of these objects. The objects which were stolen in 1897, which are distributed in over 500 collections all over the world, are considered originals and are considered to be the objects that have value. Whatever was made after 1897 is often sort of called a reproduction, even though each object is an original, because what they use is the lost wax technique, which you can see here, where basically a core is made with clay, and then the detail is made with wax, and then that gets heated and poured out, and then with metal, often recycled metal from the West, which was already the case in the 16th century when the Portuguese first started trading with the Benin Kingdom and bringing metals, and actually we see Portuguese on some of the plaques. And then the metal is poured in, and we get the object. So I was interested in showing this process, but not necessarily in a linear way, not in a way that I suppose produces a kind of sort of monolithic, ethnographic sort of gaze, but rather in this quite complex installation. The process is distributed across 7 screens, which we don't all see at the same time. And the work is called Lost Wax. And I suppose at the heart of all of this work, especially the Benin project, but also earlier works, is the notion of absence. So in the whole work, we never see one of the objects. We see the descriptions, we see them being talked about in the visitor, we see new objects produced, but we don't actually see the objects as such. So there is a sort of gap in the middle of the work. And actually I made 2 more works, which I'm not showing here, which are also connected to this. This sort of question of the gap and the impossibility of representation was something that became even more acute when I was working on a project in Jerusalem, which I'm not going to talk about sort of in its entirety, because it's quite a complex project. but I just wanted to speak about the premise of it, which is the work is called Unmade Film, and it's about a mental hospital in Jerusalem, where an aunt of mine who survived Auschwitz, the concentration camp, and she ended up in Jerusalem after the war, and had a breakdown and ended up in this mental hospital, and basically never left the mental hospital, and lived there for another 30 years and died there. And as a child, with my family, we would visit her there. So it's a place that I know sort of intimately. And my strongest memory was of the people who were mostly Holocaust survivors, because the hospital was specializing in Holocaust survivors. The people sitting around, sort of idlessly staring. There was no activities. Most of them were medicated, and sort of early on, there wasn't diagnosis of PTSD or things like this. It was considered they had some form of psychosis or schizophrenia, but all of them were broken by what happened to them. And it was only later on that kind of outside sort of influences were also considered as causes for psychic sort of things, symptoms. It was only a few years ago that I realized that the buildings of this mental hospital, which were sort of like, it was like a sort of residential place that looked like a village, and these buildings were in fact a Palestinian village, Dir Yassin, which was massacred in 1948, just before the State of Israel was declared, in order to start a process of ethnic cleansing, which was planned meticulously beforehand. And we now have kind of historical records around this. And so for me, it was shocking, to say the least, to imagine that people who survived the concentration camp were treated in a place where another massacre was committed, and the sort of craziness of this superimposition of these two histories, of these two traumas. And it kind of presented me with an aporia, because you can't compare two traumas, and you can't compare these two histories, the history of the Nakba and the history of the Shoah. So there was a kind of impossibility at the heart of this, and initially I wanted to make a film about this place, and I realized I can't, because also sort of trying to make a film would produce some form of catharsis, some form of release, that we are now engaging with this, but actually the history is not over, it's continuing. So what I did in the end was 9 works, which are all part of a film, but the film itself never comes together. So each of the works is one aspect of the film. So what we see here is the stills. There is another work. I collaborated with musicians in Ramallah, and we made a concert which was called The Score for an Unmade Film, which was commemorating the massacre, and it was happening on the anniversary day of the massacre, on the 9th of April. And so another work is the reconnaissance, another work is the staging, another work is the script, the storyboard. So each of the works extracts an element from what a film might be or how a film is made, but the film is never coming together. It's quite difficult to represent it. It would take more time, so I'm just showing the stills, which are the only images that I took inside the mental hospital today, of these empty chairs, surreptitiously, obviously. And I also wanted to speak about this because sort of as an introduction to another part of my practice, which I guess started at the moment I was doing research in Jerusalem for this work, and I came across a collection of stereoscopic negatives, glass plate negatives, which were made in the 1920s and were stored in the American colony archives. So stereoscopic photographs are basically like proto 3D cameras that have two lenses and would take two photographs. And then when you put it back together, you have these glass negatives and you put them in a viewer and you see essentially a 3D image. So it's a sort of proto 3D technology. And what was interesting for me was that all these photographs were of plants, and we had these sort of two images of the same plant, and one side of the negative experienced a corrosion and was quite destroyed. And somehow it felt like a premonition of what was to come, of partition of Palestine and of this sort of separation where now we have the flora of Israel and the flora of Palestine, which obviously is the same. So these prints, recolored prints, were coming out of that. And it was sort of the start for me to think about plants, I suppose, as agents in history and politics, and what they can teach us and what that means if we think about history through plants. So maybe we can go back to Zurich for a brief moment with this beautiful postcard from probably the time when I grew up, where sort of I have a very strong memory of the summers with these red geraniums lining the lake and the river. And in fact, all over Switzerland, you find these beautiful red geraniums that are sort of almost considered national flowers. When I started to do research in South Africa, I was invited to do research there and to present some work. I found out that what we call geraniums are in fact not geraniums, and they're not Swiss. They come from South Africa. The Dutch East India Company was bringing them over, and they were misidentified as these geraniums. It took like another 150 years for botanists to realize they're pelargoniums, not geraniums. And at that point, they became like a bestseller in all the garden centers. So the garden centers refused to rename them. So they continue to be known as geraniums most of the time. Although strangely now the garden centers label them correctly, but sort of in the general knowledge, most people talk about them as geraniums. So I was kind of interested in which plants become naturalized, in this case almost like a national symbol, and which plants are considered invasive, intrusive from another place. So the work that resulted from this is actually a postcard collection with one postcard printed quite large, and the rest of the postcards reprinted, and people can take them away. Yeah, and it's called the work is called Geraniums Are Never Red, because geraniums are never red, but pelargoniums, of course, are. So this is just as a way of introduction, I suppose, to start thinking about plants' sort of involvement in things like nationalism, in things like history. The plants that we see here were not always here, and how did they come to be here? So I did quite a lot of work in South Africa, and almost all of it was to do with thinking about plants as witnesses. And so I started to try to think about what is this more than human witnessing, and how can we understand it? So this series of photographs is called The Memory of Trees, and it shows trees that are very much connected to history, but are also sort of actors in history, not just witnesses. So this tree, for example, is a wild almond tree that was planted in the 1660s when the Dutch East India Company arrived at the Cape, and in fact arrived there in order to create a garden to grow fruit and vegetables to replenish the ships that were coming from India back to Europe and were running out of fresh provisions, and therefore had lack of vitamin C, and that created scurvy and left the ships short-handed. So they created this garden, but of course there was already a population there, the Kwekwe, who had grazing cattle, and the cattle would also happily eat the salads, of course. So they planted this hedge as a kilometer-long hedge around this orchard and vegetable garden in order to keep the cattle out. So in a sense, the planting of this tree, which still exists in part today, couldn't be considered one of the first acts of colonial violence. What we see here is a milkwood tree, which has various names in sort of oral history. It's not actually labeled, but it used to be called the old slave tree of Woodstock, also in Cape Town, because slaves were bartered there, slaves were hung there. Later on, it was where the agreement to hand over the Cape Colony was signed after the British Boer War. So it became the treaty tree. So obviously it has it has a very dark history. Another tree in Johannesburg has a different history. It's named Ruth Fisher tree. It's a poplar tree that used to stand next to the house of Ruth Fisher, who was an anti-apartheid activist. And she lent her house to be a safe house for fugitives from the apartheid regime. And so when people were running away and looking for a house, the people would be told to look for this tall poplar tree, and Ruth Fisher's house was next to it. So this tree, in a sense, literally saved lives. So, yeah, how does this sort of witnessing, this more than human witnessing work? Because of course, now I'm telling you the story. So there is also this question, are we ventriloquizing? Are we making the trees ventriloquize a history? So I was thinking about how this witnessing happens sort of in this in-between space, in something that could be called an articulate collective, where it's the tree and us that produce the historical narrative. And I think here perhaps is also a good moment to speak about ghosts. A lot of my work, I suppose, is somehow connected with ghosts and haunting. And when I say ghosts and haunting, I'm thinking of Avery Gordon's way of thinking about ghosts and haunting as something to be done, as unfinished business from the past, as questions of justice, which literally we can see also in popular culture when we have like horror movies where zombies come back, or there's like a haunted house. And the question is always, why do we have a haunted house? Because maybe a child was killed there and no justice has been done. So it's always this question of justice and of the past returning. And I suppose for me, it's interesting to sort of think about it in this trajectory of works across a long span, because I started off thinking much more about trauma and about the repetition of trauma and the afterwardsness of trauma. Freud talks about afterwardsness. we also use it in PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder. What I started realizing when I was working in Palestine in relation to unmade film, and I was also speaking a lot with psychologists, and I made a work with psychologists, was that the trauma is not necessarily over, especially in Palestine, as we know from now as well. The trauma is continuous, so it's not necessarily this afterwardsness, this safe place from which we can reflect on the trauma, but it's continuous. And so for me, haunting and ghosts was a kind of more useful way to think about how the past manifests now, and also the demands that it places on us in terms of responsibility or ethics. While I was researching in South Africa, I came across a collection of films in the cellar of the Botanical Garden, of the library of the Botanical Garden. Film reels, which had been shot in '63 and had not been seen since then, which I transferred to digital. And they were all made on the anniversary, on the 50th anniversary of the Botanical Garden, and showed the celebrations of the Botanical Garden and the visitors, who were all white. The only Africans were the workers, who kind of showed this botanical nationalism that I was talking about earlier as well. South Africa used plants specifically to create this sense of how one belongs to a place. So I was working with a friend of mine, the actor Lindiwe Machikiza, and she positioned herself in these films, she inhabited them, she confronted them, and we were sort of thinking about these archives. Here we have an actual document from the past that we felt should be seen again, but we were thinking about how one can perhaps intervene in the past or in the archive or in the document and imagine otherwise. In order to produce forms of solidarity with the past, in order to confront the past, and to kind of reactivate it with a different gaze in the present, rather than just reproducing the representational violence, which is obviously part of these images. So this work is The Fairest Heritage, which is also the title of one of the films, of these film reels, which is in English quite a multi-layered sort of title, because fair means just, it also means light-skinned. Yeah, so it refers to different things. And what was interesting is really this sort of use of plants and of the botanical garden, science, this idea of botanical nationalism through these festivities with national dances, which were Dutch dances, but also something that could be called flower diplomacy, where there were botanists invited from Europe mainly and from the US in order to come and see this amazing place, because the Cape is one of the, I think, 8 floral kingdoms in the world, because it has a huge diversity of plants. So it was a form of greenwashing, what we now would call greenwashing or flower diplomacy, where South Africa was basically cutting through the boycott, which didn't include plants, because nobody was thinking that plants matter. Flowers are just flowers. So there was already a boycott in place, but South Africa took place in the Chelsea Flower Show in London, in the New York Flower Show, and promoted itself like that. This whole kind of history of, I suppose, entanglements between Europe and South Africa in this case, but also its former colonies elsewhere, started with the colonial project, obviously, which was also a project around knowledge. It was not just around occupation and extraction, but it was also around knowledge. And what happened most of the time was that sort of early expeditions would be accompanied by scientists who would study the flora, who would study the resources in order to exploit them later, of course, but also in order to name them. And through naming them, a kind of form of appropriation happens. And when I was working in Guatemala, it became kind of really clear to me. I came across a publication from the Indigenous Institute of the University of Guatemala that was printed in the 70s around Mayan medicinal plants, which were shown in drawings, and their uses were described, and the plant was named in Spanish only. So we have the Indigenous Institute of Guatemala showing medicinal Mayan plants, but excluding the Mayan plant names. So there's this form of appropriation, and at the same time there's also a form of sort of erasure that's happening, and a continuing epistemic violence. So what I did was I started to travel with this book through Guatemala and showed it to spiritual guides from various Mayan communities, language communities, and the guides were starting to annotate the publication. So again, a sort of interference in the document, which we see here. And then the page eventually started looking more like this. And it's presented like this. It's titled What Plants Were Called Before They Had a Name. And yeah, includes these pages. I'm going to end with a few works that are closer to home. This is a photograph of the Wood Library in Belém, here in Lisbon, the Xiloteca, which was founded in 1900. And it was a place where wood samples from all over the Portuguese colonies, eventually also from other parts of the world, were collected, were studied, were analyzed in order to also see what the potential uses could be. There were specific expeditions that were continuing even when the rest of Europe abandoned its colonial sort of project. It continued here, and there were many expeditions in the 50s, 60s to the various places. Here we see an image from the university, which parts can be used. So it's sort of this notion of, I suppose, extraction, which is at the heart, of course, of the colonial project. And it goes back to Aristotle's sort of concepts. He created concepts for abstract things that we now take for granted. But for example, he created the notion of matter, and he called matter hyli, which is the word for wood, for timber. So it's kind of unformed wood that then becomes something. So the idea is that you can fashion something out of it, and that became the word for matter in general, for anything that we make out of material. But it already introduced very early on in Western culture the separation between the tree that is a living being and the wood that is simply a resource, and laid the foundation for our relationship, our extractive relationship with natural resources. Here we have an image from the Xiloteca of a kind of macroscopic image of the wood structure in order to study it. And what I noticed was that the Xiloteca and all the research institutes around it had no images of the trees. The tree was completely absent from this collection. And thinking about restitution, I guess, from this perspective, or in relation to a collection like this, a new question emerged. What would restitution to nature mean? This is not just sort of taken from another culture, but it's extracted from nature. So this work resulted, Reading Wood Backwards, which tries to think about this wood and its return, or its kind of approaching, sort of rehearsing in a way what this restitution would mean. So there is also a performance that was part of it. I don't think we have time to look at it, but
10,000 samples of
maybe
wood.
just
10,000 samples of wood.
yeah, I'm going to move on. It's kind of a longer text, which introduces the colonial project and its foundation in wood, in Madeira, and sort of tries to think what we can do with this now, or what it would mean to start returning something. And I made this project during COVID, when it was also impossible to travel. So it was only recently that I managed to travel in relation to this work. And what I was interested in was returning to the place where the first wood sample was taken from, that entered the Xiloteca, which is São Tomé. So last year I traveled to São Tomé, and we can see here the labels from the wood library, which are reproduced, sort of in relation to materials from the forest. And what I mostly did was work with somebody, Jackie Pereira, who has been going to the forest his entire life in order to collect materials from the forest that are used for medicinal purposes, including rinds, which we see here, leaves, roots, things like that. And what was interesting for me, and what was important for me, is to see a kind of non-extractive relationship with using the forest. So he takes part of the rind of the tree, but then uses earth to protect it, to cover it again. So the tree will continue to live. So it's not producing death. It's not eliminating the resource which is used. Maybe we can see 30 seconds of this.
Ao sangue. Você para o sangue. Essa planta aqui. Essa aqui é para cozinhar, para banho, para dor de corpo, pessoa que vai ter problema de acidente. E também pessoa que está com precisar de sangue, também não cozinha para dar aos poucos, para beber, para aumentar o volume de sangue.
Para o sangue.
Para o sangue.
Okay, we can't see the whole process. There's also a series of drawings that are part of it, of leaves and sort of the holes in leaves, and this is the whole installation. And I'm going to end with this work, Mangoes of Goan Origin, which is an archive of sorts. It's an alphabet of mangoes from Goa, which all happen to have Portuguese names. How come? Because when the Portuguese arrived in Goa, it was the Jesuits who brought certain agricultural techniques with them, which started to create more stable varieties, where you sort of cut a tree and you put it on another tree, and you create a clone essentially. So you have a stable variety rather than two trees mixing and then you don't know exactly what you get. So it's a very early form of cloning, which quite a lot of the Portuguese landlords at that time would practice in order to create varieties named after them. So we have Jerónimo, Monteiro, Oliveira, and so on. And so what I was interested in is sort of the occlusion again of the origin, of course, where they are from, because now they just have these Portuguese names, and the most famous one is Afonso, of course. And so I printed, it's sort of quite a complicated process. They're lithographs with silkscreen print on top. So I printed the mangoes, and each mango has the first letter of its name printed in a different language, in a different alphabet, from that world, the Portuguese Indian world of the 16th century, of the trade, of that sort of cosmopolitanism that also existed at that time, and reintroduce the diversity of these languages sort of into the biodiversity, I suppose, of the different mangoes, and connect them. So I suppose it's a gesture of linguistic restitution. These are not just Portuguese mangoes, of course, but they are part of this whole world. And I think I'm going to end here. It was quite a fast walk through works. I'm happy to go back to certain ideas, to speak more about certain things. There's lots of things I didn't talk about in terms of processes and questions of representation and position and all sorts of things. I'm happy to expand on these. But I guess it was a little bit like the exhibition, an experiment in creating an arc, which I haven't done for a very long time. Usually I just maybe focus on works to do with plants or to do with this, but actually to think around the connection between all these works. Thank you.
So now we can open the dialogue with the audience. There is a microphone. We can pass hand on hand, okay? Who wants to break the ice? Yeah.
Hi. You talked about a lot. You talked a lot about ghosts of the past, but
About?
ghosts
Yeah.
of the past. But with the rising geopolitical situation in the whole world, prosecution, wars, how do you think these ghosts that are forming will affect your art?
The ghosts that are forming now?
Yeah.
That's a difficult question. I suppose I can answer it backwards in that, as you can see, I'm kind of like ostensibly engaging with the past, but of course it's about the present. But most of my work is not engaging with the actual present and the sort of topicality of things that happen now, which we are bombarded with in the media, and we don't have any distance to it yet. And which also is often very myopic, because we just talk about sort of an event sort of in its own parameters without thinking around the whole history that has led up to that, and the ghosts that were calling for these events, or that are returning, that are coming back, or the zombies, or whatever we might call them. So for me, it's been more productive and important to think about these ghosts, and especially like with what's going on now, if I think about like what I was trying to do with unmade film, and thinking about all these ghosts which which have not been acknowledged, all the violence from the past that has not been acknowledged. I think it's important to bring that into the conversation of understanding the present. How me or we in the future will look at the present is difficult. It's difficult to say. I think, I'm not sure that I even want to speculate. Obviously, we need to be extremely attentive to what is happening now, but try to kind of open up that look and not keep it limited to what's happened yesterday and today.
A sentence that I always end up thinking of is, buy an album music, the history book on the shelf is always repeating itself. It's kind of what's happening in the end. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to listen to you. Thank you very much for your lecture. It was wonderful. But I'm still busy with some ideas that you presented to us. And the first one is this idea of restitution, the idea of, well, it's very dramatic, this mental hospital that was built in the ruins of a Palestinian village. And of course, what you say about ghosts and justice and requalification, spiritual requalification or energetic requalification of a place in Brazil, for example, is very, in the cultural field and the artistic field, it's very, very developed, this idea of a psychogeography of the city, of the places. So places of pain, places of slavery. We have a stratification of these stories to understand better the social dynamics in the present time. So I'd like to listen a little bit more about this psychogeography of the places, because I'm sure you have more to say about it. And we had recently here in these conferences, Great Artists on Campus, Grace Diritu, a British artist, Afro-descendant, and she brings to her work that has many points in common with yours, animism, spiritual rites and spiritual practices to clean up the air, to bring health to sick places, like the museum. And I would like to listen more about it, because you don't have these layers, or you don't mention it, of animism or spiritual rites or Jewish spiritual culture in your work directly to bring health or to clean up the places. Can you talk a little bit about it?
I think I don't speak about it that much, but the idea of like spiritual presence is very much there, from the synagogue to the way that plants engage with the kind of the way healers engage with plants, which is not only in relation to their use, but also a sort of spiritual quality. And in a number of works that is quite important. I suppose I'm also wary about instrumentalizing sort of animist practices in my own work, because it's not my tradition. I guess I'm coming from questions of representation as an artist, from thinking about what images and stories we tell ourselves about the world we live in and the past that has led to the present, and how perhaps I can interfere with these stories and images, and what other stories and images we need. And while I respect these practices of sort of active engagement and interference, perhaps, or trying to heal the museum, I'm not sure that's my role, like my role personally. Maybe I'm more in, like, if we're using this language, maybe I'm more of a medium to kind of channel different kinds of stories or images, or to create different kinds of consciousness. Because in a sense, like with consciousness is like where our understanding and our place in the world starts. So reintroducing kind of slippages, languages, plants also, is all part of that for me. And I think there is a kind of maybe underlying spiritual aspect to that, but it's not something that yeah. As for psychogeography, obviously it's a term that comes from situationism. It's kind of like quite specifically connoted. I guess, yeah, it's another way perhaps we can think about haunting. For me, haunting is enough to think about, like what haunting means in a place and what this sort of presence that makes us unsettled, that connects us with a violence or with an injustice, what that means. Maybe it's part of a larger psychogeography, but because it's such a specific term, I try not to, yeah, I think I don't use it.
It's a notion that got developed in these last 20, 25
Sure,
years. So
sure.
in Brazil, it has other connotations, much
Yes.
wider and complex than the
mm.
international situation is more European conception.
Mm.
More ideas? Sonia?
I find the questions and the answers super interesting. And I'm also very thankful for the arc that you presented to us, because it made me think about a vocabulary that you developed. No, I have to start a different way, and I have to make it easy for myself. What I see is a quotation or is a reference to natural sciences and its specific visual vocabulary, which is of course not a quotation, but it's a displacement, a deferral. And there's something very strict about it, as scholarly practices are supposed to be. Could you talk about that a bit, about the aesthetics that you choose and why you find them, why you employ them actually? Because, and the reason I'm asking is because I'm thinking about the role of visuality in your work and a very barred maybe way of seduction, like you're not, it's not lekker, it's not like something that I can very, very easily enjoy maybe, or yeah, I just want you to talk a bit about your aesthetic choices.
I mean, I think I've always been interested in the literal, like, and its potential, like, and I've used it in lots of different ways, even like finding the transcript of a court case and using it verbatim to restage the court case and what happens in that, or to simply show the mangoes, like very literally each mango, and interfere in that. So there is a slippage, I think. There is the literal aspect where things are what they are, but then they're not. And so I'm interested in these forms of representation which are very close to the thing. Like we see the objects being made. It's that process. We see the mango. We read the literal description of an object from the Benin bronzes. Or so it's always this kind of immediacy. And as you say, maybe it's kind of forensic almost, like showing it in order to understand what else is going on. And in order to allow for these other layers to come up. And obviously it needs some kind of intervention. So that could be that the photographs are shown as negatives. And what does that mean? What is it making us kind of sense something different? Or these mangoes have letters superimposed. What are these letters? Where do they come from? What are the languages? Why these languages? So that it becomes more complex. But it's, yeah, and I think in these aesthetic choices, I'm interested in immediacy, like we see immediately, it's all there. And at the same time, we can unpack and we can go deeper into the layers. And it's up to everyone how much they want to do that. But it's an invitation, it's a proposal to look at reality or something that's there and think, oh, but actually it's a bit different from what I thought, or something else is there. And for me, that becomes possible through this form of sort of direct representation with some form of intervention. Whether that's an actor in front of the projected films or through print, or, yeah, there's this sort of slight shift. But very perceptive, thank you.
More questions? Students? Yeah.
Hi, Uriel. Thank you for your presentation. Just a quick question. I was curious about your work, The Memory of Trees, and what you were trying to achieve with the negative images. What was your purpose? What's behind the act of showing the negatives and not the positives? Were they original negatives, or were they like digital files that you turned into negatives? What was behind all that?
They're actually, it's actually analog photography. They're taken with a medium format camera on analog film, on black and white film. So they are negatives to begin with, which I scanned, and I decided to not process them into positives. I guess returning to this idea of latency, of a latent image, which still needs to be processed. I guess it goes back to Walter Benjamin and something I read a very long time ago. He sort of uses this expression, the index of readability of images, the kind of, and how this has to happen each time. Every generation needs to read things again, images or documents or whatever. So it's never done. We can never sort of do the work of, oh, now we understand what this image means or what this place means. So this sort of, yeah, I guess ongoing demand to decipher the world, to decipher these specific signs, which in this case are these trees, is ongoing, and it's latent, it's inscribed in these trees, but it needs something to happen for us to engage with the history of the trees. So the negative was a way to sort of engage with this latency and also quite literally make them ghostly almost. That's kind of what one of the results is. And I suppose removing them from their completely real representation yeah, sort of creates a sense of something else is going on here. Yeah, I didn't speak too much about all the material processes, but they are very important. Like how I print things, the fact that these are 4-color lithographs with a silkscreen print on top. It's a very, very complex way of printing. I could have just made an inkjet print, frankly, but I didn't because it was important that the image is layered in this way. Yeah, so in the same way that it was in this case important that it was analog film, I'm not sort of fetishizing analog photography, but in this case, it was important for me.
More ideas? Students, teachers? Some of you visit the exhibition of Uriel Orlow, right, in Galeria de Avenida da Índia. So, more ideas about the experience there? No? I found your question very interesting, and I was thinking about it, and you will allow me as a friend to share with you some ideas, because talking about pain, talking about trauma in such deep level and historical, transhistorical, transcultural, geographical, what we see in the vocabulary and aesthetics of Uriel Orlow, it's someone who wants to denounce, of course, an old order, but to put back in order. There is a kind of, all the time, categorization, like a scientist, a kind of new taxonomy. And for me, it creates me a kind of, it asks me questions, because I see the artist and this story that I think it's a fundamental story in your experience of this haunt of yours that was in Auschwitz, and then she was in another kind of prison in this hospital for 30 years until she's gone. And we understand that this memory of yours visiting her, it's very, very fundamental in your vision of life and of the world. But then aesthetically, we have a very conceptual, minimalistic aesthetics, like there is a tension and invisibility, latency, as you say, but at the same time, a kind of limit you impose to yourself. Because I think the process with this guy, for example, that you follow in the jungle, that explains, and in your exhibition, these videos of him cutting the wood and taking care, it's wonderful, it's very powerful poetically. And because it's using the nature, but it's also at the same time taking care. It's making it useful, but taking care at the same time. So, yeah, it works on me. It's not a question, but it's a meditation I'm sharing with you, because I think there is a kind of self-control there all the time, and of course, putting in value and knowledge as value and research as value, and we feel the Jewish tradition there, very powerful also. But does it make sense for you, Uriel?
It does, and if we had time, I would have shown an extract of housed memory of the 9-hour film that I shot in the Holocaust archive, and that film has a soundtrack, and the soundtrack is conversations that I had with people who work there, librarians, archivists, researchers, who talk about various things. The person in the photo archive who runs the photo archive talks about her strategies of coping with the fact that she needs to hand out horrendous images like every day. How do you protect yourself from that? How do you create a boundary, in a sense, to not be re-traumatized all the time? So there is this sense of boundary, I suppose, or this sense of, of self-protection. The person who was the archivist, very interestingly, talks about the quality of paper in the 1940s without ever mentioning what was on the paper. She doesn't even consider it. She just thinks about how can she save it because the paper was bad because of the war. And so, but I also recorded a conversation with a Holocaust survivor who worked at the archive as a volunteer, translating materials from Yiddish and helping with certain things. And she says one sentence, which has stayed with me forever. It's very short but very precise. And she talks about her experience of being in the concentration camp and the experience of working in this archive with all this material. And she says the lack of drama is the whole drama. And I think it's something to do with this, when you deal with these kinds of history, which are extremely dramatic, extremely emotional, maybe kind of sort of holding back is more important than overwhelming with the kind of, the drama or the emotional. So I think that's something that intuitively was always there, but she named it, and it totally made sense to me, and still does.
So I think we can, before
and actually, she says something else after that. She says, make a list. You don't even need to tell a story. She says, make a list. Say, how many people were killed? What were their names? Make a list. So it's sort of, it's really the opposite of what the media are doing with us at the moment. We don't have lists. We need lists of everyone who was killed in Gaza. We don't need more images. We don't need more of these dramatic representations. It's this kind of thinking. And I think the list obviously is something that is important to me and keeps coming back and is part of this, I guess, literal approach.
Powerful. So before we clap and we thank this wonderful presentation of Uriel Orlow, I would like to invite you for our two events tomorrow and next Wednesday with Françoise Vergès, and that a French theoretician, an authority in Europe about decolonized thought or decolonial thought. And she'll be with us tomorrow at Galeria Quadrum at 5 o'clock, free entrance, in a conversation with me tomorrow. Tomorrow at Galeria Quadrum, 5 o'clock. And the day after, Wednesday at 3 o'clock, 3 p.m., she'll be here talking about decolonizing the museum. Free entrance also, so please invite your friends. Everybody is welcome. And I think there are many, many points in contact with the talk of Uriel Orlow today. And now, thank you, Uriel Orlow. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.